Wonderful. Okay. Last week we left off right before talking about tribes and the tribal God. And you may wonder, why would we be concerned about that? Well, again, because we're looking at the scriptures as an ancient Near Eastern text, or an anthology of texts, rather, of books. And so in a very real way, we need to understand what the milieu was, what the context was, especially when we look at Genesis, because we're getting into the story of essentially of a tribe, of a clan, headed up by Abraham, and then ultimately that becomes a nation by the time we get to Exodus. So we'll be looking at that transition from tribe to nation, and then from Exodus onwards, we look at the transition from becoming a nation to becoming a kingdom as well too. But it begins with a tribe, and in fact the whole notion of what the tribe is will give us some understanding of many of the things that we see in the Old Testament, because even though Israel becomes a kingdom, they always refer to the 12 tribes. So the tribe is the basic unit of Israel. So ancient Near Eastern society was very tribal and clan-oriented. The tribal clan, which is essentially the extended family, was the basic building block of their society. And it is this social grouping that preserved the survival of its individual members. Hence, in the ancient Near Eastern societies, to be exiled from the tribal clan was effectively a death sentence. So especially since the tribal clan was often situated in close proximity to the only available fertile land and water, example, oases. So it is in the context of the tribal clan that the individual has the best chance of survival. Imagine trying to survive in the wilderness, protecting yourself from wild animals, foraging for food and water, and defending against multiple enemies and threats 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by yourself. It doesn't work so well. Even though in America we pride ourselves on rugged individualism, we actually really do depend on others to be able to survive. That's what civilization is all about. Last night I was watching, or maybe it was the night before, I was watching a new documentary on TV called The Frozen Planet. I love documentaries, grew up watching them. In fact, in Trinidad, again, it's a third world country, but when I was growing up, they only had one channel for most of when I was growing up. The explosion of channels came much later, but we had just one, and much of what they would have on would be documentaries. So I would take this in every day, delighted in it. But this particular documentary, The Frozen Planet, they had these emperor penguins, and it was interesting. You had the male penguins would be entrusted with protecting the egg, whilst the mother would go off to get food to bring back. And so for however long the mothers were gone, the male penguins will sit on the egg to nurse the egg. But Antarctica, which is where they are, has one of the most, well, not one of, the most severe winter on Earth. And so what they would do is huddle together to be able to combine all their body heat to be able to survive. So imagine an emperor penguin being excluded from that huddle. How is he going to survive by himself? Not very well. And in many respects, it's a great analogy of the tribe. Now for us, again here in the States, it's hard to imagine, but consider the Pilgrims, for example. If you were living in that type of society where you didn't really know a whole lot about the surroundings, you didn't have a whole lot to go off of, and you weren't particularly a mountain man or anything else like that, then just imagine what it would be like to be excluded from the village and said, hey, you got to fend for yourself. You have no idea what's poisonous, what's not, and you have no idea where the wild animals are. You can't tell when animals are tracking you. You can't track them. And good luck. We're not even going to give you a knife or anything else like that. You're out on your own. And so you get the sense of being isolated. So in a Near Eastern society where you're in the wilderness, for example, and there's one oasis. This is a place where you have water, and there's miles and miles of wilderness with wild animals, scorpions, whatever else, and no water and beating sun during the day, cold temperatures at night, and you are excluded from the tribe, then you will die. And in fact, later on we will see, when we start talking about covenant, we see that basically to be part of, to enter into the covenant is to be part of the covenant people, and to be excluded from the covenant is essentially a death sentence. It's very similar. So you'll see how that begins to tie in. So most people would not last very long without the cooperation of others, without community. Some can be on guard while others sleep. Some can forage for food and water while others hunt, etc. Likewise, the survival of the tribe or clan depended on good order and harmony in the clan or tribe. So that in the ancient Near East, the tribe or the clan is indeed the basic unit of survival. Now, the tribe or clan is essentially, as I said, an extended family over which the tribes or clan's head, the patriarch or the ab, from which we get Abba, or Abbot, all right, the father, the patriarch, is over the tribe or the clan. Now, patriarch is interesting because the word itself is a combination of two words, right? One is archi in Greek, or archon, which means head or ruler or chief or the first. The protos. And pater, which means father. So, pater archi, patriarch, patriarch. That's where we get the word from. It means the chief father, the head father. So he is very much a father. And just to give you a little bit of an insight, it's not in my notes, but I'll give you this nonetheless as an insight into the ancient Near Eastern notion of fatherhood. It's that the way the father relates to his children, the children are very much like servants. In fact, the children are indistinguishable from servants until they reach of age. So they're expected to do what they're told. And if you read through the entire Old Testament, you see that a father can be very harsh sometimes, but he does that for the good of his children. And it's only when the children mature that they are able to inherit certain things, and then they move into the status of being treated more like lesser equals, rather than, say, just servants. Now, what's interesting about that as well, too, is that when a Middle Eastern father wants to say something to a son who's kind of messing up, he's not going to go to that son and say, hey, you need to straighten up. He's going to tell his daughter, maybe, or an older brother, an older son, I want you to go and talk to your brother and talk some sense into them. And they will go and do it. And that's actually his mercy. Because if he has to talk to that child after they ignored the brother or the sister whom he sent to talk to them, it's going to be heck to pay. It's not going to go so well. And if you think about it for a moment, that is kind of like what we see with the prophets, right? In fact, in the gospel passage this past week here, we see Jesus giving the parable of the owner of the vineyard who sends one servant who are really the prophets after another, and they're mistreated and ignored. One is beaten, one is killed, and then eventually he sends his son. And then at the very end of that parable, Jesus asked the Pharisees, what do you suppose the owner of the vineyard will do to these rebellious vine dressers, who killed his servants and beat them up and also killed his son? And then they themselves announced that he will destroy them utterly. So it's very interesting to see, again, how the Middle Eastern, ancient Near Eastern notion of father, you definitely see that reflected in God's relationship with us, even in the New Testament. So those who would imagine that the God of the New Testament is somehow different from the God of the Old Testament, or maybe he's getting older, so he's having senior moments or something like that, and he mellowed out with age. He hasn't mellowed out with age at all. It's very much the same God we're dealing with. It's just that the terms of the covenant that we have with him have changed somewhat, but he's still very much the same God. So back on track, the tribe, or the clan, as I said, is headed by the patriarch. The patriarch is not so much supported by the clan or the tribe, which is the extended family, as much as he is the one who supports the extended family and holds it together. So it's not like in modern times, perhaps, where maybe you have a king or a queen, and the society predominantly supports them. They're kind of a figurehead. Now, in the ancient Near East, the head of the tribe, the patriarch, was key to the survival of that clan or tribe. And in fact, if you look at in Genesis, you look at Abraham, you realize that the tribe lived off of his wealth. It wasn't the tribe's wealth, it was his wealth. They were his sheep, his cattle, his servants. And so, in a very real way, the patriarchs in the ancient Near East were extremely important to the survival of the tribe as a whole, and that they provided for, in much the way we understand a father provides, he did provide for them. Now, they also did provide services in return, so to speak, but it's not so much a contractual thing as much as it is a relational thing. And when we get into covenant, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, the other aspect of the patriarch supporting the extended family is that he holds it together. He is the point of unity. What's interesting, though, is Ignatius of Antioch says in the early 2nd century, he says that where the bishop is, there is the Catholic Church, which is a very interesting thing to say because, again, he's actually borrowing this ancient Near Eastern way of thinking that where the patriarch is, that's where the tribe is. It's very much very similar language if you think about it. So at any rate, the other aspect of the patriarch, apart from holding things together, holding the center together, is that the tribe depends upon the wisdom of the patriarch in a very, very clear way. So if you have a foolish patriarch, you're sunk. And when we get to the biblical notion of wisdom, you'll see it's very, very different from our notion of wisdom. I'll just simply say it's kind of like this. When you learn to survive in the wild, and you can identify what plants are medicinal, what plants you can eat, what plants are good for nutrients that you can make tea with, what plants are poisonous, and you begin to be able to distinguish those things, then you're beginning to come to some ancient Near Eastern sense of what wisdom is versus what folly is. The wisdom is knowing what you can do and what you can't do. What will help you live versus what will cause you to die. So it's important that the patriarch be a wise man, that he knows when to make alliances with other tribes or clans, or when to go to war, or when to move the tribe, because maybe this oasis is going to dry up, and through experience he knows that at a certain time every year this oasis is going to dry up, but there's another one over here where the tribe can actually get sustenance. So he is the one he's the man with the plan, so to speak. The other thing about that relationship between the patriarch and the tribe is that the tribe in turn has to have the ability to harmoniously obey and follow the patriarch. What's the point of having a wise patriarch if you don't do what he says? If he says don't touch that's 50,000 volt electrical wire and you will die, and you touch it, then you will die. So again, the survival of the clan and the tribe is not only based upon the wisdom and the ability of the patriarch to provide, but also on the tribe's obedience and adherence to the wisdom and the guidance and the direction of the patriarch. So if he says you're in, you're in, and if he says you're out, you're out. He really has a lot of authority, so you don't want to cross the patriarch. You just have to look again at Genesis and see when Hagar eventually is thrown out. I mean, she really is thrown out. And they despair for their lives because really it's a death sentence, and it's only because the Lord intervened and sent an angel that Hagar and Ishmael didn't perish. So the patriarch, then, that relationship between the patriarch and the tribe or the clan is essential to the survival of the tribe or the clan. The patriarch is also the one who interacts with the deity and is thus priest, exercising fatherhood not only in the natural but in the supernatural. This would be true of Israel until the institution of the Levitical priesthood at Mount Sinai. So throughout the book of Genesis, you will see very much the father, the patriarch, functioning as a priest. In fact, even in the book of Judges, you still see some remnants of this. There's a story where a father wants his son to become a priest. So he says to him, I want you to be, he's talking to his son, I want you to be a father to me. And it's an expression in scripture meaning I want you to be a priest. He was a Levite, I want you to be my priest. And so and for that reason, they refer to them as a father. Now, just a little bit of trivia. There's an Arabic word for grandfather. It's called judu. And I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of it, but it's actually the word that Jedi is taken from. It's judu, and it's a grandfather, the wise one, the elder. One of the things you'll see is that in the ancient Near East, it was assumed that if you had gray hair, you were very wise. When I came to, in fact, in Trinidad, which is I describe it as a Latino, African, East Indian type of a culture, very vibrant, very well-educated society, and in many respects, very much occupying all the different three categories of the supernatural worldview is part of the whole paradigm for people from this place. But it's one of those things where you're told that to respect your elders and listen to what they have to say, especially for the older folks, because they are wise. And then I came to the United States and I realized that was not necessarily true. That gray hair and age did not necessarily mean that people got wiser. Just some of the shenanigans I would hear of older folks getting into. When I first got here, I was shocked. What do you mean? They've lived longer. They're supposed to know better. But it was not necessarily true. In ancient times, though, you didn't live very long unless you were wise. Because sooner or later, you would have done something stupid along the way that would have just wiped you out. Now, these days we have other people looking out for us to make sure that we don't destroy ourselves. There was no one policing people back then against stuff like that. You were either wise or you were foolish. And if you were foolish, you didn't live very long. And you were wise, you lived to have gray hair. So anyway, the tribe or the clan is typically known by the name of the founding father or patriarch. Example, Israel is named after Jacob Israel. Edom after Edom, who is the brother of Jacob Israel. And then you have, and likewise, the history of the story of the founding father becomes the story and ultimately the destiny of the tribe or the clan. So if you know the story of the founding father, you can usually tell how things are going to turn out for the tribe. And when we get into Genesis 6, and we start looking at Ham and his shenanigans, you begin to understand why the Canaanites were the way they were. And I'll just give you a brief preview of that. If you have a Bible handy with you, we turn to Leviticus 18. There are lots of people out there who would say that Leviticus is boring, but I don't know. Some of this stuff reads like you have to censor some of this stuff. It's not fit for prime time viewing. Okay. Look at verse 6. Oh, I'll go up to verse 1. And the Lord said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you dwelt, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall do my ordinances and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my ordinances, by doing which a man shall live. I am the Lord. Then he goes on to say, none of you shall approach anyone near of kin to him to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not cover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister. And it goes on. Now remember, what happened in Genesis was that Ham had apparently walked in on his father's nakedness and then went and told his brothers about it. And his brothers were aghast, and they got a cloth, and they went in walking backwards and covered the nakedness. Well, then the very next thing that happens is that Noah curses Canaan. He doesn't curse Ham, he curses Canaan. Well, when you understand Leviticus 18 is talking about incest, and then you begin reading Genesis 6 a little bit differently if you understand what Leviticus is saying, and you get some very interesting ideas. Well, what's interesting about the Canaanites, why they're being commanded not to do what the Canaanites do, is because the Canaanites engage in incest and temple prostitution and every kind of sexual perversion possible. Well, the Canaanites are named for their founding father, Canaan. All right, who was accursed. Well, why was he cursed? Why would Noah curse Canaan and not Ham? Well, some theologians and some rabbis would suggest because Canaan was the product of his incestuous relationship with his mother. Well, why would he do something like that? Well, if you look at what happened with David and I believe his son Absalom, who wanted to basically rebel against his father and to usurp his father's authority, he went up under the roof and slept with his father's concubines, and this was his way of asserting his dominance over everything that was his father. So basically, the Lord appointed Shem to be the firstborn son of Noah. He's the firstborn son, and the promises to him, right? Japheth will live and will dwell in the tents of Shem, all right, but Canaan will be subject to Shem. You have that. And now the Canaanites, right, are these people that are living in the promised land. Well, the land, if you look at the text very carefully, the land in which the Canaanites are living in is actually the land that was promised to Shem. And if you look at it very carefully, you'll see that Abraham is actually a firstborn descendant of Shem. And so basically what God is doing is he's restoring the land to who it rightly belongs to. The promised land is actually being given back to the descendants of Shem, and essentially what you have happening is that the Canaanites had usurped that land essentially for centuries from the descendants of Shem by occupying it and by doing the very things that their founding father had done. Now, when we get to those texts, we'll get into that a lot more elaborately. I just gave you the scattershot, the buckshot version of it, but we'll get sniper specific when we get to those verses. Okay, I promise you that. Now, the tribal god, the god of the tribe or the clan, is usually the god of the founding father. Which is, again, interesting because in the book of Ruth, for example, when Ruth says, your God shall be my God, it's your people shall be my people. Again, it's when you become a member of the tribe, all right, the tribal God becomes your God as well. So you're initiated into the tribe. You're also initiated into the tribal religion, the covenant relationship with the tribal deity, which is why, again, in the Old Testament understanding as well as the New Testament understanding, the ancient Near Eastern understanding of coming to Yahweh is like you don't come to Yahweh in your own terms. You come to Yahweh, right, vis-a-vis becoming part of the covenant people. There's no interaction with Yahweh apart from the people that he founded. And this goes all the way back to the tribal deity. So that the tribe then, the god of the tribe is usually the god of the founding father, and the founding of the tribe or clan is typically inseparably intertwined with the revelation of the tribe's God to the founder. And we see this definitely in the book of Genesis with Abraham and then Isaac, Jacob, and so on. Now, and the revelation of the deity is generally tied to a specific geographic location. And from then on, the deity identifies itself as the God of the geographic region. For example, you can see examples of that in Genesis 12, 7 through 8, Genesis 28, and also chapters 10 through 22. Chapter 10, verse 20. That should be chapter 28, verses 10 through 22. Now, the first theophany, should back up a little bit. So, from then on, the deity identifies itself as the God of the geographic region of the first theophany. So wherever the theophany took place first, all right, the deity will identify itself as the God of that particular region. So you see, for example, Jacob referring to the God that appeared to him at Bethel, for example. So. And then also, the deity will also identify itself as the God of the founding father. So you see several times when Yahweh reveals himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So again, the identifying himself, not sometimes the deity would identify itself with the geographic location, and other times with the founding father, or the chief founding fathers in succession, or sometimes all of the above. So, it is the site of the original theophany that becomes the principal center of worship of the god. And the god tends to refer back to the original theophany in its interaction with both the founding father and subsequent generations of the founding father's descendants. So you see this happening again at Sinai, referring to the covenant of Sinai. But you also see this happening with Abraham. Of all the promises that Abraham was given, all those promises are kind of put together and perfected in Genesis chapter 22, where you have the sacrifice the near sacrifice of Isaac. But what's interesting is that Moriah, right, the place where he has Isaac all bound up and on the altar, and he's about to sacrifice him, right, before this happens. And Isaac asks him, Abba, Father, where is the lamb that we're going to sacrifice? I see we have the wood, we have the cord, we have the fire, we have the knife. Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham answers, from Isaac's standpoint, somewhat cryptically, I suppose. From our standpoint, with a great deal of faith, he says, the Lord will provide. Well, the spot in which the Lord provides the lamb that will be sacrificed is Moriah, which later on is the central point around which Jerusalem is. Well, what does Jerusalem mean? Jeru means God will provide. So it's on Moriah that later on becomes Jerusalem, and it's on the very spot that Isaac was to be sacrificed on that Christ later is sacrificed. It's amazing how Jerusalem becomes central. Moriah is still central to the Old Testament and very much at the heart of the New Testament. In fact, the New Jerusalem, again, Jerusalem being the point of reference, and this is the place where the quintessential, the theophany to sum up all theophanies in the life of Abraham takes place in this one spot that would factor so significantly in the history of the Jewish people from beginning to end. You see it from Genesis, going all the way down to the prophets, that Jerusalem is very much at the center of the whole deal. So again, when we get to those points in Genesis, we'll spend a lot more time talking about that. But I just want you to get a feel for the way the tribal God operates and how that's understood. So, as tribal life became more settled and more tied to the land and less nomadic, cities began to develop. Because the thing about the tribe is that it's like military tactics. The more troops you have, the more logistics are involved in being able to move. Right? And it's hard to shoot, move, and communicate, which is what you do as an infantry unit, when you have to move all this additional equipment and personnel and staff and everything else like that. So if every time you have to move, you have thousands of camels and thousands of sheep and goats and everything else like that, as you begin to grow, it begins to become harder and harder to move around. But in addition to that, as you begin to move into areas where you can actually do some type of farming and other things like that, you're also able to grow some of your food, as well as to take care of sheep and all these other things. So at some point, these tribes began to grow and they began to settle down and become more stationary. And you had the development of the city. Now, the city is nothing like what we would call a city. The city back then was nothing like Manhattan or anything like that. It wasn't even what we would call a town or a village, perhaps. But according to their standards, it was a city of the day. So city life back then, like I said, is nothing like our cities. They typically consisted of a palace, right, with a temple attached to it, or at least in very close proximity to it, and a few dwellings around the central complex. There were often no streets separating buildings. So just imagine just kind of smashed together kind of a thing. No streets or anything like that. But there would be a city wall, however basic. It could be just, basically spikes in the ground, wooden spikes or whatever. And of course there were city gates. Now, typically the gates were in full view of both the palace and the temple. It was at the city gates that commerce was done and the disputes were resolved at the city gates. Again, commerce being done under the watchful eye of the deity, of the god of the city, as well as of the palace, with the king being very often the representative of the deity as well. So it was the city gates where commerce was done, and it's also, by the way, at the city gates that wisdom would be traded. So if the wise elders would sit in the city gates, because there'd be people coming from other parts of the world, and they would exchange wise sayings, and it was kind of the currency of the day. So people were less concerned about maybe gossip type news, and more concerned about wisdom that would make them wiser. And so you'd have people that would exchange ideas about and information about the world in general, things that they had learnt. And so they would have this kind of discourse, and would very often happen at the city gates, which is one of the reasons why in the Old Testament, again, you'll see several situations where the elders are where? They're at the city gates. That's where they are. Because that's where business is conducted. That's where disputes are resolved very often, and it's also where wisdom is traded, knowledge is exchanged. So it's kind of the university of its day, if you will, with no tuition. So if you were smart, if you were wise, and you were young, you would be silent at the city gates, because in the presence of the elders, you'd be silent so you could hear what they have to say. And because the understanding was that if you were young, you were inexperienced, you had no wisdom, and so the posture was you listen and you learn, and that's how you became wise. And eventually, as you became wise and older, and you survived utilizing the wisdom, then you in turn would become an elder as well too. And in fact, the interesting thing is the word priest is the Old English word for presbyteron, which means elder. It's the old man. So the phenomena of having priests that are really, really young is more of a recent phenomena. Usually, the canons say at least 30 years of age and so on. But the whole idea, though, is that the priest is an elder. He has some life experience. He has practical wisdom, and he has spiritual wisdom as well too. That's kind of the ideal. So again, it's the whole idea of the elder. And So you have some idea of what the city is like. Now the king, now we come to the point of the king. As city life required increasing specialization, merchants, craftsmen, priests, etc., the structure of the clan was not sustainable, and eventually the patriarch was replaced with a king. Now the king could be a very young person, or it could be an old person with lots of wisdom. The king, having received that office by popular consent, right, but more often not by popular consent so much as by the express will of the deity. In other words, this is God's man. He's God's representative. In fact, in some Near Eastern cultures, the understanding was that the king himself was divine. But more normatively, it was understood that the king was a representative of the deity. So the king very often functioned as a priest, as well as a religious, as a political figure as well too. So the king having being the one chosen by the deity. So whereas the patriarch was recognized as authoritative by all because he was the preeminent wise elder, the king is recognized ultimately because he is seen to be the chosen one, the one called and recognized ultimately because he is a chosen one, the one called and given authority by the deity, and the one who serves as the deity's representative to the people, and the people's representative to the deity. Now, what's interesting about that is that the chosen one, that's why the kings are anointed. It's a sign of they're set apart, they're anointed by the deity. Now, the king then becomes the one held responsible by the deity to rule according to the will of the deity, often expressed in the writings kept in the temple. So the king then is responsible for doing the will of the God of the kingdom. And as I said, the will of the God of the kingdom is often written. And again, in those days, it's only the king and the king's household that could afford to have people who could write. They didn't have paper quite like we have it today, and they didn't have most people didn't know how to read or write. So again, it was only something that the king could finance. So the terms of the king's rule, the standards by which the king was required to rule by the deity would often be kept in the temple. So, and the king becomes the one who holds the people accountable to the law. He's held accountable by the deity, and he holds the people accountable as well. So the king was often seen as the divine, or as representing the divine. Among the Israelites in particular, the king ruled on behalf of the deity, on behalf of Yahweh. In other words, the king served as locum tenens, the Latin for in the place of, or the placeholder for the deity. Now, literally one who fills, locum tenens basically is literally one who fills in temporarily. So by the time we get to the whole idea of the kingdom in Israel, right, at least in the Jewish understanding of the kingdom, the king is a representative of the deity, taking the place of the deity, not in the sense of replacing the deity, but he's kind of holding down the fort, so to speak. He's representative of the deity. Now we go on. The one thing that we must understand is that like with the patriarch, with the tribe and the clan, the people depend on the king as much as he may depend on them. And the fate of the kingdom is tied intimately with the fate of the king and vice versa. Furthermore, the deity does not deal with the people apart from the king. Once you have a king, right, the deity isn't going to deal with Joe Schmo, right, or, Billy Bob or Sue or whoever else, apart from dealing with the king. The king is a representative. But even in that case, right, there are exceptions in the Old Testament, and you will see that. The exception, of course, being the priests, the prophets, and the judges, and so on. Not the judges, but other individuals. For example, Amos was not really a prophet, He was not a prince or anything like that, and God does use him. So it's not a universal rule, but it's a case in most circumstances, most situations. So anyway, the fate of the kingdom is tied intimately with the fate of the king and vice versa. Furthermore, the deity does not deal with the people apart from the king. In some kingdoms, the deity deals with the king through the mediation of a priest. But even in that case, the priest typically interacts with the deity on behalf of the king and not on behalf of the people. So again, even when there's a mediator as a priest, for the most part, the priest is acting as the mediator between the king and the deity, and not really between the deity and the people. That doesn't happen in Israel until we have the Levitical priesthood and everything else like that. Furthermore, the deity, let's back up a little bit here. In other words, the king embodies the people even when a priest serves as mediator with the deity. The king embodies the people. So this is why when the king blows it in Israel, right, the whole kingdom has blown it. And when the king is faithful, the whole kingdom benefits from that. So if the kingdom is unfaithful, then a good king will make sure that he'll whip those people in line, right? He'll get them in line. Otherwise, he's a bad king, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. So thus, in the Old Testament, we see the development of Yahweh dealing with the patriarchs of Israel on behalf of the whole clan, to Yahweh dealing with the entire nation of Israel by dealing with the king as a representative of the whole. So we go from the patriarch interacting with the deity on behalf of the clan or the tribe, to the king interacting with the deity on behalf of the whole kingdom. Now this is important because in the Old Testament, as in other ancient Near Eastern contexts, God does not deal with individuals for their own sake unless they are the founder of the tribe or the clan, or the kingdom. So once the tribe, the clan, or the city, the kingdom has been established, the deity deal with the people as a whole through their representative. Thus, the only way to have a connection with God, to be able to pray or worship Him, it must be as part of the people that He has established in the place, words, and manner that He has prescribed. This is the ancient Near Eastern understanding of how you relate to the deity. So I'll say that again. The only way to have a connection with the deity, to be able to pray or worship Him, must be as part of the people that He has established in the place, words, and manner that He has prescribed, and through the mediator that He has established. This is why you have the sons of Aaron going in to the tent of meeting and offering strange fire and getting struck down. They didn't get struck down so much because they were offering worship to God. They got struck down because they failed to do it the way God prescribed. And so understanding how ancient Near Eastern people viewed this whole thing will give us a great deal of insight into what we see happening not only in Genesis but also in Exodus and in Leviticus, and begin to understand why it would be a mistake for these guys to go into the tent of meeting and to do their thing, and then they were struck down. They were supposedly doing something good, but we will see that the ancient Near Eastern idea of interacting with the deity is that it's not sufficient to have good intentions, right? You have to intend to do the thing that the deity prescribes specifically. So at any rate, it goes on. Let's see, here in my notes. Therefore, in the Psalms, we see that prayers are often the words of the king, or else the prayer of the king, which is very interesting. In the Psalms, you see that the prayers are, the Psalms themselves are often prayers that are either the words of the king, right, or else they're patterned after the manner that the king prays. And there's a reason for that, because the king is the one who is set apart as the representative of the people to go to Yahweh. The manner in which the king or patriarch approaches the deity is the manner or the pattern in which the people or the tribe or the clan or the city, the kingdom, approach the deity. So, if you look at a lot of the prayers in the Old Testament, you see they really are very much patterned on the prayers of the patriarchs, the prayers of David and of Solomon. And this is especially true in the Psalms. Now, this is at the heart of how ancient Near Eastern civilizations typically approached worship. In the ancient Near East, as in Scripture, there is no concept of private religion or individual faith. It's just not there. It was always, what you did as part of being the people. I mean, the notion of being an atheist, for example, and being part of Israel was just just unheard of. All right, you're part of Israel. You worship the God of Israel. That's how it was understood. If you were an Edomite, then you worship the God of Edom. If you were a Philistine, then you worshipped, the god of Philistia. But if you left Philistia and you wanted to become an Israelite, then you abandoned the gods of the Philistines and you worship the God of Israel. This is why, again, in the book of Ruth, you have Ruth saying to Naomi that your God shall be my God and your people shall become my people. Because the two things are intertwined. The God and the people go together. So in the ancient Near East, kings weren't so much generals as they were judges. The Supreme Court justice in the United States are appointed for life. This is kind of very close to the idea of what a king is in the ancient Near East. This was what, I'll say that again. The Supreme Court justices in the United States are appointed for life. This was what the kings were like. And one of the primary functions of the king was to render judgment with impartiality and to do justice. That was the function of the king, to render judgment with impartiality and to do justice. That is, to protect the helpless and the vulnerable. The king is strong precisely so he can be strong on behalf of those in his kingdom that are weak. That's the understanding of what a king is supposed to be. What a good king is supposed to be. And often this justice is done through rendering judgment on behalf of the weak. So we begin to see glimpses of how the New Testament understands Christ as king. So judgment and justice in these senses are primarily what is behind the ancient Near Eastern and therefore the Old Testament's notion of what righteousness is. Righteousness embraces right judgment as well as just action. So you judge correctly, but you also act correctly in accordance with the principles of justice. Which in the Old Testament, again, is understood as justice is making sure that those who are the weakest are provided for, are protected, are taken care of. There is no concept in the Old Testament or in the New Testament of righteousness apart from taking care of those who are most vulnerable. That is one of the many reasons why it is impossible from an ancient Near Eastern standpoint to not be pro-life, to not be anti-euthanasia. We have a responsibility to protect the weakest. We have a responsibility to take care of the widow, the orphan, or the disenfranchised. And that's very much the heart of what the king is supposed to do. Which is why, again, in the prophets, when you see the prophets railing against the kings, it's not so much because they were engaged in idolatry, even though they were, and the prophets rail against them for that. But the prophets rail against them not only for idolatry, but especially for not taking care of the widow and the orphan and the weak. Because again, it is at the very heart of what it is to be a righteous king. So in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms, the king's seat, or the cathedra, from which we get cathedral. Cathedral means that's where the seat is, that's where the chair is, that's where the throne is, all right, was the throne of righteousness. The throne was supposed to be a throne of righteousness. And if there is no righteousness, there is no throne. All right, to be a good king, to be truly the king, you have to be a righteous king. Which is why when we get to Genesis and you look at Melchizedek, Melchizedek, means king of righteousness. So, in fact, the king is most functionally, now again, speaking of the throne, the king is most functionally the king when he's seated on the throne, precisely because his throne is the judgment seat. When the king is seated, it is to render judgment. So, when you talk about Judgment Day, the notable thing is the Lord isn't standing, he is seated. Because that is when judgment is rendered. Thus, when the Lord is seated on his heavenly throne, it will be to render judgment. So when we get on Judgment Day, if he's standing up, we're good. If he's seated, bad. Standing up, good. Seated, bad. Because it means that it means judgment is about to happen. So let's examine then the king's function more closely so that we encounter, as we encounter kings and pharaohs in the Old Testament, and in particular as we see God, Yahweh, revealed as king, we begin to understand what it means to be king. The king has to be king in the ancient Near Eastern sense, you have to overcome all the enemies of your reign and of the kingdom. The first basic enemy, all right, is the enemy of basic enemy of the king and of the kingdom is water and the elements. All right, but specifically water. Water is necessary for life, but too much is destructive. It's bad for you. It can be very powerful. What's interesting is when we look at Genesis, right, we see that the earth was a formless void, and the Spirit of the Lord moved over the face of the deep, right, the face of the abyss. And we talk about primordial waters. The understanding is that waters represent chaos and destructive power. And so the king has to be able to overcome, has to tame, has to make water submit. However, the king can build dams, he can build aqueducts, he can do stuff like that. But his power over water is still very limited. He can make sure his people have enough water to drink and everything else like that. But when, for example, if you're Pharaoh and the Nile overflows and people die, right, everyone sees that the king has very limited power over water. And in fact, the king must then go to the deity for the deity to take care of water, ultimately. So, with that in mind, think of the miracles of Jesus specifically. Think of him turning water into wine. Think of him walking on the water. Think of him, right, calming the waves and the wind. And you begin to realize that Jesus, right, is systematically demonstrating that he is king. Not only that he is king, but that he's a righteous king. This is why when he performs these miracles, the people begin to refer to him as the Christ, as the Son of David, because they understand these messianic cues. And because here you have a guy who doesn't have to appeal to the deity to be able to get water under control. He speaks a word to the water, all right, and the water responds to his command immediately. He has so much control over water that he walks on the water. And what's interesting is that we see this miracle in the Synoptic Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, but we also see it in John as well. He walks in the water, so we know that this is an event that it's not symbolic only, that he walked in the water. But the fact that he walked in the water historically is a demonstration, right, of his messianic authority as king, that he has subdued water. The first enemy has been taken care of. Now the second enemy, right, is the wind. So the first enemy is water. The second enemy that the king has to overcome is wind. And again, all right, Maybe the king can have some kind of a windmill type device, right, where they can grind grain and stuff like that to make bread for the people or whatever else like that. But by and large, right, for the king to have dominion over the wind, he again has to appeal to the deity. Here comes Jesus, who rebukes the wind. And by the way, rebuke means stop it. That's all it means. It just means to say stop it. He tells the wind, just imagine, he gets up there, right, and he commands the wind. He just simply says, stop it. And it stops. Just like the, with the centurion, who understands that he's a man under authority, and if he says to one of his servants, do this or do thus, or one of his soldiers, they go and they do it. And this is why Jesus was so pleased with this man's faith, because he understood that Jesus had authority. So that when Jesus said, stop it, right, to the winds, they stopped. So Jesus, you see clearly here that Jesus is the king par excellence, because he does not have to stop to pray to be able to command. He doesn't have to offer a sacrifice for the winds to stop, for the tornadoes to stop, for the hurricane to stop. He speaks to it, and it ceases immediately. And so you see that again, that he is the king par excellence, because he has dominion over the wind. Then the third enemy for the king is the other nations that have to be subdued. The other enemies are enmity with the nation of the king. Now you see that this is where most kings are able to kind of do their thing. You have David, for example, who's able to subdue the enemies of Israel, the Philistines and others like that. And we look at Jesus and we say, well, he didn't subdue any nations though. Well, I submit to you that he did. Because the idea of the king having victory over his enemy, right, there are two ways he could do that. He could defeat them, right, or he can make them his friend. He can convert them. And what does Jesus do? All right. Every single one of us at this table, unless you have Jewish ancestry, are goyim. Unless your mother is a Jew, right, we are all goyim. We're all Gentiles. We're all the nations. And what has happened? The nations have come to bow down before the Messiah, before Mashiach, before Jesus. So he didn't defeat us in military combat, so to speak, but we have all become his followers, his subjects. And so you see that Jesus again is king par excellence. He defeats his enemies, the enemies of his kingdom, by making them his subjects. So again, you see Jesus again is king par excellence. Then the fourth and the last enemy is the wicked. Is the wicked. In biblical terminology, all right, is that which appears good, but is really crooked. The wicked then is being two-faced, hypocritical, and betraying. The enemy then is not outsiders, but rather insiders. The fifth column, as it were. In Europe, in medieval Europe, the way they understood warfare is that you'd have four columns. One column to the north of the city, one column to the south, one column to the east, one column to the west. You surround the castle with siege, and you attack from all four sides, all directions. Those are the four columns. Well, the fifth column would be that you'd have people who had infiltrated the city and who were already there, right, who would then turn on their comrades, stab them in the back, and open the city gates so that the enemy could come in from the outside and destroy them from within. That's what the fifth column is. So the enemy then, the wicked then, the fourth enemy is the wicked, which are like the fifth column. Think of Judas. Judas is a quintessential example of what the wicked is. The person who pretends to be a friend and who will betray you with a kiss, who will stab you in the back. And so the king has to find out who the wicked are. It's very difficult. He needs wisdom, he needs discernment, and he has to be very careful. But the wicked are a clear and present danger to his rule. Because if he does not root out the wicked, they will do him in. We see Jesus is betrayed by the wicked. He's, also by the scribes and the Pharisees, but specifically by Judas. He's betrayed. But we know that Jesus is not, we know in the liturgy we say that, that he was the one who gave himself up. Yes, he was betrayed by Judas, but it was not against his will. He knew that Judas was going to betray him. In fact, he told Judas, "Go and do what you've already set out to do." So he was betrayed, but he wasn't betrayed without knowing that he was going to be betrayed. See, the problem with the king is you have the wicked and you don't know where it's going to come from. You don't know how to prepare for it, and it comes from out of the blue, and you're sleeping in the night and you're stabbed, right, or you're poisoned or whatever else. Well, Jesus knew who his enemy was. He knew what he was going to do. He knew that Satan had entered into Judas, and so he gives himself up freely to the process. He's crucified on the cross, all right, and he rises again, victorious. That even the betrayal of the wicked is not sufficient to end him. In fact, it serves his purposes. And so we see Jesus turned the wicked on their head, so to speak. So this is how we understand kingship in the ancient Near East. And I use Jesus as an example because we're all familiar with the New Testament. But when we go through the Old Testament and you look at kings, you look for these different traits and you will see, right, that a good king is one whose throne is established on righteousness, which is good judgment, impartial judgment, and doing justice. All right, taking care of those that are least fortunate. And who do we see Jesus taking care of? Who does he preach to? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are you who meek. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are you who mourn. In fact, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, if you want to understand the Sermon on the Mount in context, you have to understand that these are the people that he just cast demons out of. These are the people who were blind that just were able to see. These were the lepers. These were people that were on the fringes, the outskirts of society, who had been touched by him and whom he had just preached the good news to. And because of his presence, right, he says, blessed are you. So he's addressing these people specifically. So yes, these are spiritual qualities, right? But we should not forget the original context. The original context is who he was addressing. And the reason why they are blessed is because Mashiach, Messiah, has come. The righteous king is present. And when the righteous king is present, those that are weakest are lifted up. The humble, right, are lifted up, and the exalted are brought low. This is the doing of Mashiach, the doing of the king, of the righteous king. So we see Jesus in those terms. And again, as I said before, when we go through the Old Testament, you will see again that is very much the heart of what it means to be a good king. And when the prophets judge, all right, bring words of condemnation to the kings, it's because they have abandoned partial judgment. They have abandoned taking care of the weak. They're more concerned about themselves and their own pomp and wealth than they are with the welfare of the weakest people in their society. And when they aren't busy taking care of conquering all these different enemies. Now, we will end with we're talking about shalom, and then we'll have a time for question and answer. And I promise you, we are getting very close to Genesis. I promise you we're getting there. Shalom, or peace, right, in the Old Testament, it is only when the king has conquered all of the above enemies, or has made them things beneficial to him and to the kingdom, that there can be shalom or peace. I want to say that again. It is only when the king has defeated, the enemies, water, wind, right? The nations, the wicked. When the king has established victory in all these fronts, that there can be peace or shalom. So in the ancient Near East, the biblical understanding of peace is not the absence of war or strife, but rather total well-being, a perpetual state of victory, a combination of undisturbed rest or untroubled life with joy. So, for the ancients, an important component of peace is joy. If we have not overcome the passions, if we have not overcome the enemies that we struggle with, right, and we have quote-unquote peace, that's serenity maybe, but it's not the peace that Scripture talks about. The peace that surpasses all understanding is the peace that has come about because Jesus is victorious and because we have entered into that victory ourselves through living in the light of His gospel teaching. Putting to death the sinful nature, as St. Paul says. Not that we have a sinful nature, but in the sense of the sinful tendency within ourselves, the old man, as Paul refers to. Putting to death that is in us that opposes the reign and the rule of God the most. When we overcome these enemies, then we begin to experience rest. Then we can rest. When you're still doing war, you can't rest, right? I mean, you're doing war. How do you rest in the middle of a war? When you're being shelled, if you're in Afghanistan and you're at Camp Rhino, for example, and you're being overrun by Taliban insurgents, right? That's not the time to take a coffee break and say, okay, I think I'm going to rest. Now I'm going to go to sleep right now. You might not wake up, okay? There's a fight going on. You're supposed to be at your position fighting. But when you've defeated the enemy, all right, then you're able to rest. And so rest is an important component of that. And in fact, we'll talk about the Sabbath rest. It's a recurring theme throughout Scripture, the Sabbath rest. Right? The other component is joy. If we don't have joy, it ain't peace. Okay? It may be a state of being medicated, but it ain't peace. There has to be joy. And joy is not the same thing as happiness. Right? But joy is a sense of well-being, of a certain sense of that everything is okay, that we are overcoming, of well-being, of I hate to say happiness, but happiness. I don't mean happiness in the glib sense of, oh, I'm so happy, but in the sense of it's something deeper than that, more profound than that, right? That we're able to laugh, that we're able to smile, right? Joy is when you're dealing with cancer, and you're still able to find things to smile about, to laugh about, to rejoice about, right? To give thanks for in the midst of that. So that's the ancient Near Eastern understanding of shalom or peace. And so you see how peace really, shalom, is really tied to what the patriarch does, to what the king does. If you have a good king, right, who is able to vanquish his opponents, to vanquish the enemies of the kingdom, and to root out the wicked, then there'll be peace. But if you're in a kingdom, you have a king, and yes, he's vanquished the enemies from outside, but he hasn't taken care of the enemies within, right? Then you have somebody murder the king, and then you have this power struggle going on, then you don't have peace. You have strife. So it's only when the king has conquered enemies on every side that you have this shalom, this peace. So we'll pick up next week with wisdom, and with that, I'll open up to questions, comments, thoughts. Sometimes I can be guilty of assuming that you can read my mind, and so it may not be in my notes, it may not be something that I say, but I may just have assumed that I communicated that to you in some way or the other. So feel free, please. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
Since a Christian seems to be at perpetual war throughout his whole life, how do we find peace within the midst of that?
It's a good question. Well, first of all, any victory we have is rooted in the fact that Christ himself is victorious. that he has defeated all of the enemies. So what we're doing is we're entering in our warfare. We're following his footsteps in that warfare. We're entering into what he has already accomplished. That being said, right, there are enemies in our own life that we have to take care of. We deal with water. Water represents chaos and confusion. We all deal with chaos and confusion in our lives in many different ways, and in some literal ways and some figurative ways. Wind. Wind is in Hebrew, ruha, wind, breath, is also spirit. We do wrestle with principalities and powers and the rules of this present darkness. We do wrestle against demons. There's the demonic realm that we have to do battle with sometimes. So then there's the other people. Sometimes there are other people who they persecute us. They make life miserable for us, and we do contend with that. Which is why Jesus said, "Bless those who curse you, pray for those who persecute you, and love your enemies." Because the way we do battle with our enemies, so to speak, is by praying for them to become our friends, by praying them into the kingdom, right? And of course, the other enemy is the wicked, right? That part of who we are that shoots us in the foot if we let it. If we don't address our own sinful tendencies, if we don't deal with that, right, then we find ourselves engaging in self-sabotaging behavior. So when we begin to address those things, when we begin to stand up to those things, and through Christ's victory on the cross, right, we begin to wage war in the light of his victory, and by the grace that he gives us through the Holy Spirit, then we begin to experience, increasing degrees of peace. The full peace that we won't know this side of glory. Right, we'll know on the other side of glory, but we can attain to a certain measure of peace even now. Because you're absolutely right, we're always, we're continuing to struggle, we're continuing to fight. The problem, though, is that many of us don't know that we're in a fight. And if we don't know that we're in a fight and we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, we will never have any semblance of peace whatsoever. But that's how I would answer that. Any other questions? Thoughts?
During the captivity Israel and Egypt, did the patriarchs function at a lesser level due to their captivity, or were they basically extinct? Hence, where we get the
right.
Judge.
Well, what happened is, I think when Jacob died, he was the last great patriarch, really, and then Joseph was kind of the next one, and when he died, all the 12 sons of Jacob had passed away. I think what probably ended up happening then is you had tribal elders that functioned as an eldership type of a thing, which is why when Moses was sent to them, he had to talk to a group of them. He wasn't talking to just one guy. He had to convince all of these people to act together. So what happened then is they kind of returned to the head of each of the tribes and the clans, and you see actually Moses dealing with that, and in fact, these are the people that eventually that God would have him have a measure of his spirit to be poured out upon these ones to help him in administering the people. It's a good question, yeah. Does that answer it, though?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Now, I know some of this stuff is a little bit on the dry side, and I promise you we're getting into, it's going to pay off. Again, the reason why I asked you to look at the who, what, when, where, why, for and key words as well, for Genesis 1 through 4, that's not the format we're going to be using for the whole study. But I want you to get used to looking at things very closely. And Genesis 1 through 4 definitely bears, it definitely is one of those passages where it's going to pay off to examine it very closely, because there are many little nuggets there. Once we get past that, the format we'll be using would be, I'd recommend, again, you don't have to do this by any means, but it'd be to use 3 columns essentially. One column that has the passage, the verse. The other column would have observations you make based on the verse. And then the next column would have questions that you come up with as a result of looking at the passage. So what we'll be going with ultimately will be you'll bring your observations and questions. We'll discuss those observations and questions. We'll have interchange about that. That's what you'll be sharing with. And then we'll be looking at addressing some of those questions, commenting on some of those observations, and then I'll be supplementing that with some of the other material that I have in terms of giving a more panoramic look at the text that we're looking at. That's kind of where we're going. So again, it's going to be really up to you guys to a large degree to make this a worthwhile process. The thing about it, though, is that if we don't understand the things I'm talking about now, right, it won't prevent you from getting a lot out of the Bible study. But if you do understand what I'm saying, what we're looking at here is an introduction, then you'll get infinitely more out of the passages that we're looking at. And you'll begin to understand what's happening in Leviticus. So when you read Leviticus, you won't think, man, this thing is putting me to sleep. This is the most boring thing I've ever read. You begin to make connections and make associations. So stay with it. When we get to the Psalms, and we get to things like Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, a lot of the things I said about kingdom and kingship is going to really become very, very, very important. But you will see the echoes of it in Abraham's dealings with Yahweh as well too. You'll see you'll see how it's developing along those lines. So it will pay off, I promise you. And then hopefully you will wonder, you look at the passages and you'll see things that you've never seen before, hopefully. And if you've seen them before, you'll see them in a new light, hopefully. Any other questions? Or?
During the captivity under the Roman yoke,
yes.
How do we interpret the King Herod at the time? Does he follow the same vein as all the other wicked kings of Israel throughout the Chronicles? Or is it the usurpation by the Pharisees that kind of take on that role as king? And they're lorded over the people and all those connections.
It's a good question.
To the rulers. So.
It's a kind of a combination. If you look at how the people of Israel regarded Herod, it would be hard to suggest that he was really a legitimate king. He was probably he was a puppet, right, at best. He was not 100% an Israelite, so that they would have had problems with that alone. He was not from the line of David, which meant that he was a usurper, and he was a thug. He was a tyrant, and all his sons were. They were, the most amiable of them cut off the head of John the Baptist, and he was the nice one. So it's. I think they were seen as sellouts by most conservative Jews.
Wasn't he just mainly put in place as a figurehead by the Romans?
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of like the Romans came in and they need to have somebody. It's usually better. It's kind of like an eparchy. If you think of what happened with Constantinople, with the fall of Constantinople, with the Ottoman Turks, they came in and they figure, how do you rule these Orthodox people? Now we're such a difficult, stiff-necked, hard-hearted, difficult people. We're peculiar in so many different ways. How are you going to take care of these people? Well, let's put one of their own in charge of them. So let's put the patriarch in charge of them. He'll take care of them. And it's kind of like that. The Romans looked at the Jewish people who were a lot like us, and they figure, yes, we'll have Pilate and others like that, but let's put one of them in charge of them. And so he's really working for us. But he knows them, they know him, and that's how we'll take care of it. So he literally was a puppet regime, essentially. Does that make sense? Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Well, in that case, then let's close with a prayer. And I'm going to turn this off as soon as I figure it out.